Hello and welcome to this NCFE CPD session exploring the Level 1 New Style English papers and mark scheme as of October the 17th, 2025. Hello and welcome. My name is Patricia Devlin and I'm a Provider Development Officer for Functional Skills. My role is to support centres through the planning, onboarding and CPD process of NCFE qualifications. This CPD session is a recorded version of the session that was held on December the 18th, 2025. You may wish to pause the recording during the session to complete the activities. The objectives of this session is to explore the Level 1 English Functional Skills papers and mark schemes. So we'll have an overview, then we look at the reading, the writing and a summary at the end. So this CPD session is designed to support English Functional Skills teachers in understanding the structure and the demands of the Level 1 Functional Skill English Assessment and Mark Scheme. So I'd just like you to have a few moments to think, where do you sit at the moment on how confident you feel in your knowledge of the new style papers and using the mark scheme for the NCFE Level 1 English Functional Skills. So 10 for extremely confident and 1 for not confident at all. And we'll review this at the end of the session. So firstly, an overview of the changes to Level 1. The reading assessment at Level 1 is broken into two tasks. The first section will use Source Document 1 and the second section looks at Source Document 2. At Level 2 there are 3 activities and comparison and analysis are now assessed across all 3 activities, in which has allowed for the removal of the longer style analysis question. At Level 1 this will always be in the second section but may also form part of Section 1. Guidance on the word range are given for one of the tasks. This is to ensure that a reasonable amount of words are used to meet the criteria. Online have a word count and a reasonable estimate in handwriting, so what the learners have been used to. So it's a good example of it's an example of good practice to get your learners to know what 150 to 250 words look like in their own writing, or the number of paragraphs they normally use, just so they're familiar with it. The mark scheme notes for subject content statement 24 that a response must meet the requirements of the word count where given to be awarded the mark. If no word count is stated, then the response must be over 100 words to be awarded this mark. It also notes that for subject content 23 and 24, prompts do not need to be strictly adhered to in order to access all the available marks. Full marks are awardable so long as the response is relevant to the question, clear and otherwise successfully meets the criteria for subject content statement 23 and 24. And you can see on the screen now we have an example of the type of question for Level 1. So we've got Activity 1, which is to write an email. And this one with an email, it doesn't have the word count. However, Activity 2, to write an article, that does state that the article must be between 150 and 250 words. In terms of the writing assessment and how they are broken down, at Level 1 and Level 2, it will assess a formal letter, article, review, formal email, leaflet and formal report. The assessments are made up of 2 independent scenarios and are not linked. As you can see, the SPAG makes up a high percentage of the marks. So before we have a look at the mark scheme and exam paper, we're going to start with looking at some specific questions such as language and organisational features for Level 1 and what learners are expected to know. So starting with question 4, this question requires learners to identify a language feature. So at Level 1, learners may be asked about any of the following language features: adjective, direct address, emotive language, exaggeration, rhetorical question, rule of 3, simile, statistics, For organisational questions, the learner may be asked to identify an organisational feature and or to locate the information using an organisational feature. For example, the learner must identify a feature and B, give the name of the section. Inference is often an area that learners find difficult. So general advice for subject content statement 2.15, as the learner must infer meaning from the image or images, which is not explicit in the text. So the learner should ensure that their answers are not simply a description of the image and that their answer is not written in the text. Question 17, this is a multiple choice question and addresses subject content statement 2.18, and the right is use of punctuation. The learner may be asked about the following punctuation: brackets, exclamation marks, capital letters, commas, and inverted commas or speech marks. There are changes to the comparison question, so now it's not a longer written response. The learner would need to refer to both texts and then answer the question. As you can see in the example on question 20, this is an objective test question and the learner must tick the statement that applies. So the first one is correct and you would put a tick. For question 21, the comparison is also a multiple choice question that has two correct answers. In this example, the learner must select two things that are mentioned about cars in both text. So now let's have a look at a reading paper and responses. So you may wish to have a look at this and then pause the recording while you have a go at marking it and then come back to the recording to find out the answers. So here we have question 1 to 3 and at the other side we have the mark scheme. So you may wish to pause the recording while you mark this. And you can see there the marks awarded and the marks available. So for question 1, they got the mark. Question 2, they got the mark, but question 3, they got 0 out of 2. Next, you've got question 4 to question 6. Again, you may wish to pause the recording and then we'll go through the answers. So this question requires learners to identify language features. A quote is given from text 1, complete and utter devastation. The only awardable answer is exaggeration. The language features that learners may be asked are on slide 12. This response was 1. Question 5. This requires the learners to work out the meaning of words using in a dictionary or other strategies. For example, gauge whether the given word is used in a verb or noun. Here the learner is required to explain the meaning of the word lodged, specifically as it is used in the phrase lodged under the footbridge. And in this answer, the response was 0. And question 6, this question is about the use of organisational features. Here, the learner must identify a feature and give the name of the section, and they got 1 mark for numbered list, but 0 for 6B. So I'll give you a few moments again to look at questions 7 to 10. So this question is asking learners to infer information from two photographs that is not written in the text. So question 7a would be given 1 mark, as would anything along these lines. Question 7b, this would not be awarded a mark as this is a description and not inference. Examiners will award marks for any valid inference. Question 8. This question assesses the ability to understand specialist words in context, and here the learner is expected to explain the meaning of the word flash as used in the phrase flash flood. This would not be awarded 1 mark as the answer is not quite right. In the text, the word flash is used as an adjective, and this answer not only gives a verb but is also not the correct meaning. And question 9 and 10 tests basic comprehension skills. Question 9 requires the learner to name 2 places other than Newton that have been affected by hailstorms. There are only 2 possible answers, which are Dinbury and Falton. And question 10 requires the learner to identify who to call in case of a gas leak. And again, there's only one possible answer, National Grid. So now looking at section 2 and question 11 and 12. This tests basic comprehension skills. So question 11, here the learner must find one effect of the storm on Naomi. This answer would not get a mark as it doesn't say how Naomi was affected. In question 12, the learner must state 2 things that Naomi is grateful for in her job. She says getting time off when she needs it, having the perfect job. This would get 1 mark for the time off comment, but having the perfect job does not fulfill the requirements of things Naomi is grateful for in her job. It's not sufficiently specific. Also some general advice, examiners will only mark the first 2 examples given. So the learner should ensure that the only answer contains 2 parts. Question 13, this is an objective test question, and to identify meanings in text and distinguish between facts and opinion. The learner must state whether each of the 2 statements given is a fact or an opinion, and there is only 1 correct answer. And in this case, the learner got them both correct, so scored full marks. I'll give you a few minutes to have a look at question 14 to 16. So this question is testing knowledge of language features, and the learner must identify specific language features. So 2 adjectives that Naomi uses to describe her work and skills. So this answer would be awarded 1 mark for fine, the second bullet point in the mark scheme, but while big is an adjective, it's not used to describe Naomi's work or skills. So learners will only get the mark if they quote the specific adjective word. And question 15, this requires the learners to work out the meaning of the word using a dictionary. For example, to gauge whether the word is used as a verb or noun. And here the learner is required to find 1 word to replace the word extreme in the sentence. The whole town was gridlocked with extreme flooding. This answer would be awarded 1 mark as it's synonymous with the words in the mark scheme. Question 16 is an objective test question, and this is recognizing vocabulary associated with specific types and purposes of text. And here the learner must state whether each of the 2 statements given is an example of persuasive or explanatory language. There is only 1 correct answer. In this case, the learner has them both correct. Next, looking at question 17 to 19. You may wish to pause the recording while you have a look at this. So this question 17 is a multiple choice question and addresses subject content 2.18, and the right is use of punctuation. The learner may be asked about the following punctuation, which was on the earlier slide that we looked at. I think that was slide 15. And here the learner must decide why PDR is in brackets in the second paragraph. And there is only one answer. A, it is short for paintless dent repair. Question 18. This question asks the learner to identify the organisational feature that is used to explain how paintless dent repair can save people money. And there is only one correct answer, bullet points. However, examiners would also accept similar wording, for example, bullets or bulleted list or bullet pointed list. And question 19 asks the learner to identify specialist words in context. They must find the word that means dents in the last paragraph of text 2. The only wardable answer is dings for 1 mark. Next, you may wish to pause the recording to have a look at question 20 and 21. So these two questions compare information, ideas and opinion in different texts, and the learner will need to refer to both texts to answer these questions. Question 20 is an objective test question, and here the learner must tick the statement that applies to both text 1 and text 2. There is only one correct answer, the first box, which says both texts say that the car body repair shops have had more work due to the storm damage. Therefore, this learner's response is incorrect and scored 0. Question 21 is a multiple choice question and has 2 correct answers, and the learner must select 2 things that are mentioned about cars in both texts. The correct answers are B, doors, and D, roofs. So the learner got 1 out of a possible 2 marks. So there you can see the marks at a glance. So section 1, they got 8 out of 14, and section 2, 11 out of 16, with total 20 out of 30 marks. Next, we'll move on to level 1 writing. So in this section, we're going to look at 3 responses to the writing assessment. We will look at learner A, and you may wish to pause the recording and spend a few minutes answering learner A. We'll then go through the marks. We'll do the same for learner B and then learner C. So for this, you will need to download the mark scheme, which can be found in the assessment materials section on the level 1 English page. So you may wish to pause the recording while you have a look at learner A's response, and you're going to be looking at the detail, content, format, structure and language, paragraphs and complex sentences, spelling, punctuation and grammar. So let's go through the answers. So this was awarded 11 marks. So it got 1 out of 2 for the detail. So one task on each paper will give a word count and the learner must write within this given word range. In this case, no word count was given, but the learner has just written 75 words, so there's a limited and it's rather concise. So 0 marks are awarded for the length, but 1 mark has been awarded for the inclusion of detail appropriate for purpose and audience. For content, it was awarded 1 out of 3, so the response is limited and is sometimes accurate in communicating information. Format, structure and language. So this was given 4 out of 4. The email address is correct and there's an appropriate subject heading. The email has a beginning, middle and end, and the language is fit for purpose and audience. Paragraphs and complex sentences. So that was given 0 out of 2. The attempt to write in paragraphs is not convincing as all attempts consist of a single sentence. Sentences tend to be compound or simple, and there is one attempt at a complex sentence. So for spelling, they got 2 out of 3. The response demonstrates generally correct spelling of straightforward words. Punctuation, 1 out of 3. So commas are used in place of full stops. Lowercase I is used for the personal pronoun, and the subject title starts with the lowercase. And grammar, 2 out of 3. So no fundamental errors. However, the learner wrote fewer than 100 words. They have not been able to demonstrate a range of accurate and effective sentences constructions. So next we have learner B. And again, you've got those subject contents that we're looking at and the totals, what they are out of. So you may wish to pause the recording again while you mark this. So let's go through the response answers for learner B. So for the detail, the learner got 1 out of 2. So the response has some appropriate detail for purpose and audience, but the response has fewer than 100 words. For content, 1 out of 3. The response is underdeveloped, but sometimes clear and coherent. Format and structure and language, 1 out of 4. The email address is incorrect and the subject heading is not very clear. There is an introduction but no conclusion, and the language is appropriate for audience and purpose. For paragraphs and complex sentences, 0. One single paragraph cannot be awarded a mark and there's no complex sentences. For spelling, they got 0 out of 3. There are several errors, including the incorrect spelling of many straightforward words. For punctuation, there is no range demonstrated. However, beginning and ends of sentences are correct. And the grammar, there's no fundamental errors. However, as the learner again wrote less than 100 words, they have not been able to demonstrate consistently correct and effective sentence construction. So this learner was awarded 6 marks. Next, we have learner C. You may wish to pause the recording while you have a look at the mark scheme and allocate the marks. So let's go through the marks for learner C. So in the detail, this got 2 out of 2. The detail is appropriate to the purpose and audience and the response is of an appropriate length. For the content, 2 out of 3. The response is generally accurate in communicating information. It is generally clear and coherent. Format, structure and language. So the sample papers are available on the NCFE website. Guidance documents will be available shortly, and they will be found in the Assessment Materials tab on the website. Level 1 reading, there is now more emphasis on the assessment of a main point of a text. There's also more accessible assessment of comparison skills, and at level 1 there are 2 activities. For the level 1 writing, there is a more accessible mark scheme, and the duration of level 1 writing has been increased to 70 minutes. So I'd like you to have a think about what is your key takeaway from this session. And just to reflect on how do you feel now using the new style papers and mark scheme for the NCFE Level 1 English Functional Skills qualification. We did this poll at the beginning, so it was 10 for extremely confident and 1 for not confident at all. So here we have a link to our functional skills events and webinars, as well as our best practice network, Teach, Share, Transform. So thank you very much for your time, and I hope you found this short recording useful. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to get in touch. Thank you.